My name is Dominic Reeves, and I'm a construction foreman who survived the first 30 days of the Ice Age apocalypse. When Yellowstone erupted and plunged the world into volcanic winter, I had 8 men under my command and no idea how to keep them alive. The temperature dropped 50 degrees in Phoenix. The government collapsed. People started dying. I made decisions that saved lives and decisions that got people killed. This is how a man who built bridges learned to build hope in a frozen wasteland. Before we start the video, let us know what country you are tuning in from in the comment section below. Perhaps we will make a story there. Let's begin. My name is Dominic Reeves, and September 15th, 2025 started like any other Tuesday in Phoenix. I was standing on the half-finished Central Avenue overpass at noon, watching my crew pour concrete in 108-degree heat. 20 years in construction, 8 of them as foreman, and I thought I knew what a bad day looked like. I had no idea I was about to witness the end of the world. I remember checking my watch because I was about to call the second water break of the day. Tommy Vasquez was operating the crane, Miguel was on the concrete pump, and 6 other guys were spread across the bridge deck doing finishing work. The radio in my hard hat was crackling with the usual chatter from other job sites across the valley. Everything was normal. Everything was routine. Then the sky went black. Not storm cloud black. This was different. Like someone had thrown a massive gray blanket over the entire city. The temperature gauge on my hard hat read 108 degrees 1 second, and then I watched it start dropping. 106. 104, 102. The guys stopped working and looked up. Traffic on Interstate 10 below us came to a complete stop. People got out of their cars and stood in the middle of the freeway, all of us staring at this impossible darkness that had swallowed the sun. Tommy's voice crackled through my radio from his position 30 feet up on the crane. "Boss, what the hell is that?" He was pointing west toward California, where the sky looked like it was raining mud. That's when the emergency broadcast started coming through on every frequency. Yellowstone had erupted. The entire supervolcano had blown 3 hours earlier, and the ash cloud was spreading across the continent faster than anyone had predicted. I'd watched enough Discovery Channel documentaries with my daughter Jessica to know what a supervolcano meant. Millions of tons of volcanic ash and debris shot 30 miles into the atmosphere, blocking sunlight across half the planet. Volcanic winter. The same thing that killed the dinosaurs, except this time we were the dinosaurs. Jessica always loved those nature shows. She was studying engineering at the University of Colorado, following in her old man's footsteps, though we'd had words about her wanting to switch to art therapy. I thought she was wasting her potential. Looking back, that argument feels pretty stupid now. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in the first hour. By 3 in the afternoon, it was snowing in Phoenix. Actual snow, in September, in the desert. I'd lived in Arizona my entire 42 years and had never seen snow stick to the pavement. Now it was piling up on our fresh concrete, like nature was mocking everything we'd built. My crew gathered around me as the snow started falling harder. These weren't office workers or retail employees. These were tough guys who'd worked construction in desert heat, mountain cold, and everything in between. But I could see fear in their eyes. Miguel crossed himself and started praying in Spanish. Tommy climbed down from the crane and asked if we should head home to our families. That's when I made my first decision as a leader in this new world. I told them no. The roads were already clogged with abandoned vehicles. The ashfall was getting thicker by the minute, and visibility was dropping to maybe 50 feet. My modified Ford F-350 work truck was loaded with emergency supplies, tools, and equipment that I always kept on hand. Years of working construction sites had taught me to be prepared for anything. I had Mare Ease, bottled water, first aid, supplies, a portable generator, and enough fuel to run it for weeks. More importantly, our construction trailer was built to withstand weather. It had heating, insulation, and space for all of us. I'd rather have my crew alive and together than scattered across the valley trying to get home to families who might not even be there anymore. Sarah had been gone for 3 years now. Car accident on her way home from work while I was pulling overtime on a highway project in Tucson. The guilt of not being there when she needed me most had been eating at me ever since. I wasn't going to let anyone else under my command face danger alone. The emergency broadcast kept getting worse throughout the afternoon. The ash cloud was moving faster than meteorologists had calculated. Airports were shutting down across the western United States. The power grid was failing in multiple states as ash contaminated electrical systems. Cell phone towers were going offline. The governor of Arizona declared a state of emergency and advised everyone to shelter in place. By evening, the temperature had dropped to 60 degrees. 60 degrees in Phoenix in September. The snow was 6 inches deep and still falling. We huddled in the construction trailer with the generator running, listening to emergency broadcasts on my battery-powered radio. The news kept getting worse. Ash fall was reported as far east as Kansas. Crop failures were expected across the Midwest. Supply chains were breaking down as transportation systems failed. Tommy tried calling his wife on his cell phone, but the towers were already overloaded. Miguel kept trying to reach his mother in Tucson. One by one, the cell networks went down completely. The landline in our trailer still worked, so I tried calling Jessica at her dorm in Colorado. The phone rang and rang with no answer. I told myself she was probably in class or studying at the library. College kids don't answer their phones. But deep down, I was starting to worry. That first night, we still thought this was temporary. We figured the ash would settle in a few days, the sun would come back, and life would return to normal. We had enough supplies for a week, maybe 2 if we rationed carefully. The government would figure something out. The military would organize relief efforts. We just had to wait it out. I assigned everyone tasks to keep busy and maintain morale. Tommy and Miguel took inventory of our food and water supplies. Carlos and Jake worked on reinforcing the trailer's insulation using materials from the job site. Pedro and Luis organized our tools and equipment. Frank, our oldest crew member at 58, monitored the radio for updates. I started planning how we'd extend our resources if this lasted longer than expected. The second day brought more snow and colder temperatures. The radio broadcasts were becoming more sporadic as stations went offline. We learned that the ash cloud had circled the globe and was blocking sunlight across most of Nurica, Europe, and Asia. Agricultural regions were reporting crop failures. Livestock were dying from respiratory problems caused by ash inhalation. Major cities were losing power as electrical grids failed. That's when we lost our first man. Carlos decided he couldn't wait any longer to check on his family in South Phoenix. Despite my warnings about the ash and cold, he took his pickup truck and tried to drive home. We found him 6 hours later, less than 2 miles from our site. His truck had slid off the icy road and flipped into a drainage canal. The ash had clogged his air filter and his engine had died. He tried to walk back to us but got disoriented in the gray, ash-filled air. Hypothermia got him before he could find shelter. I'd been responsible for crew safety for 8 years. OSHA certifications, safety meetings, hazard assessments, emergency protocols. I thought I knew how to keep people alive on a job site, but this wasn't a construction accident. This was the end of the world, and Carlos was dead because I hadn't been able to convince him to stay put. The guilt hit me harder than losing any contract or missing any deadline. That night, I tried the landline again to reach Jessica. This time, the call wouldn't go through. The long-distance networks were failing. I started monitoring emergency frequencies on our construction radios, hoping to pick up information about Colorado. What I heard wasn't encouraging. Denver was reporting massive power outages. Boulder had lost communication with the outside world. The University of Colorado campus had issued evacuation orders, but there was no word on where students had gone or how many had made it out safely. Day 3 brought our first real test of leadership. Frank came down with what looked like pneumonia from breathing ash-contaminated air. Our first aid supplies included basic medications, but nothing for serious respiratory illness. Pedro wanted to take one of our vehicles and try to reach a hospital. Luz thought we should move Frank to a better shelter. Tommy suggested we try to signal for rescue. I had to make a choice that would set the tone for everything that followed. We couldn't risk losing another person trying to reach help that might not exist. We couldn't move Frank in his condition. And signaling for rescue would just reveal our location to anyone else out there who might want what we had. So I decided we'd make our stand right here with what we had, and do everything possible to keep Frank alive using our own resources. That decision probably saved our lives, though we didn't know it at the time. Over the next few days, we started hearing reports on the radio about hospitals being overrun and then abandoned. Medical facilities were running out of power, supplies, and staff. Emergency services had collapsed across most of the country. If we'd tried to move Frank, we would have found empty buildings and frozen corpses. Instead, I organized our group like a construction crew tackling a complex project. Tommy used his mechanical skills to modify our heating system for better air filtration. Miguel and Lise worked on improving insulation and weatherproofing. Pedro monitored Frank's condition and administered what medications we had. Jake maintained our radio equipment and monitored for emergency broadcasts. I coordinated everything and made the hard decisions about resource allocation. Day 4 was when the government broadcast stopped. The emergency alert system went silent. Local radio stations started going off the air one by one. The last Phoenix TV station signed off with a message telling people to seek shelter and conserve resources. After that, we were on our own. I started keeping a detailed log of our supplies, our daily consumption, and our plans for extending resources. Military training from my younger days kicked in. Inventory management, rationing protocols, security considerations. We had maybe 2 weeks of food if we were careful. Water for a month, thanks to melting snow. Fuel for the generator for 3 weeks at current usage rates. But the real problem was going to be long-term shelter. Our construction trailer wasn't designed for extended occupancy in severe weather. We needed better insulation, more space, and a more reliable heat source. I started studying the abandoned buildings around our job site, looking for something we could fortify and defend. That's when I spotted the shopping mall about 2 miles east of our position. Westfield Desert Sky Mall had been struggling even before the eruption, with half the storefronts empty and foot traffic declining for years. But it had everything we needed. Large enclosed spaces, multiple access points, loading docks for vehicles, and a central location that other survivors might find if they were looking for shelter. More importantly, it had structural advantages that my construction experience could exploit. Steel frame construction, reinforced concrete, multiple levels. For defense and existing infrastructure for utilities. If we could get there safely and secure the building, we could create a fortress that would protect us through whatever came next. On day 5, I made the decision that would define the next phase of our survival. We were going to leave our construction trailer and make a run for the mall. It meant abandoning the job site where we'd built our first shelter, leaving behind equipment and supplies we couldn't carry, and venturing out into a world that was becoming more dangerous by the day. But staying put was a death sentence. Frank was getting worse despite our care. Our supplies were dwindling. The trailer was developing structural problems from the weight of accumulated snow and ash. We needed a permanent base of operations, and the mall offered our best chance of long-term survival. I spent day 6 planning our move with military precision. Route selection, load distribution, emergency contingencies, defensive positions. We'd travel light but carry everything essential. Tools and weapons, medical supplies, food and water for 3 days, radio equipment, and the portable generator. Everything else would have to be abandoned or retrieved later if possible. The guys trusted my judgment because I'd kept them alive this long, but I could see doubt in their eyes. They knew as well as I did that leaving our shelter was a huge risk if the mall was already occupied by hostile survivors, if we couldn't secure the building. If we got caught in the open during bad weather, we could all die. I thought about Jessica that night as I finalized our plans. She was tough, smart, and resourceful. If anyone could survive this disaster, it would be her. But I had no way of knowing if she'd made it out of Colorado, where she'd gone, or if she was even alive. The not knowing was eating me up inside, but I couldn't let it paralyze me. I had 7 men depending on my leadership. 7 families counting on me to bring their sons, fathers, and brothers home alive. As I loaded my gear into the truck that morning, I found myself thinking about the bridge we'd been building when the world ended. Bridges are about connection. They bring people together across obstacles that would otherwise keep them apart. Maybe that's what I was supposed to be doing now. Not just surviving, but building connections between survivors. Creating communities that could endure whatever came next. But first, we had to make it to that mall alive. And as I looked out at the ash-covered wasteland that Phoenix had become, I realized our real journey was just beginning. The morning of day 7, I loaded my Ford F-350 with everything we could carry. Frank was barely conscious, running a fever that our limited medications couldn't break. Tommy and Miguel helped me rig a makeshift stretcher in the truck bed using construction materials and sleeping bags. The rest of the crew packed our essential supplies, the portable generator, tools, weapons, medical kit, and 3 days' worth of food and water. The 2-mile journey to Westfield Desert Sky Mall should have taken 10 minutes in normal conditions. Instead, it took us nearly 4 hours to navigate through the ash-covered wasteland that Phoenix had become. Abandoned vehicles blocked most roads. Downed power lines created hazardous obstacles. The ashfall had mixed with melted snow to create a thick, slippery mud that made driving treacherous. I used my knowledge of construction zones and back roads to find a route that avoided the worst of the debris. We passed house after house with doors standing open, families having fled with whatever they could carry. I made mental notes of which homes looked like they might contain useful supplies for future scavenging runs. Every abandoned pharmacy, grocery store, and hardware store was a potential resource, but also a potential threat if other survivors had the same idea. About halfway to the mall, we encountered our first other survivors since Carlos died. A family of 4 was trying to dig their minivan out of an ash drift near a gas station. The father flagged us down, begging for help. His wife was holding a baby, and they had a young boy who couldn't have been more than 6 years old. They were underdressed for the cold, and the baby was crying constantly. This was my second major leadership test. We had limited space in our vehicles and barely enough supplies for our own group. Taking on 4 more people would strain our resources and slow us down. But I couldn't drive past a family with a baby and a small child. Sarah and I had talked about having more kids after Jessica, but the timing never seemed right. Now, looking at that crying baby, I realized we'd never get that chance. I made the call to help them. We got their van unstuck and escorted them to the mall. The father, David, was an accountant who had no survival skills, but was grateful for leadership. His wife, Maria, turned out to be a registered nurse, which was exactly what Frank needed. Their baby, Sophia, was only 8 months old, and their son, Carlos, was scared, but trying to be brave for his parents. Having Maria's medical expertise probably saved Frank's life. She diagnosed him with severe pneumonia complicated by ash inhalation, and started him on a more aggressive treatment plan using supplies from the mall pharmacy. She also warned me that without proper antibiotics, we could lose him within days. That meant our first priority at the mall had to be securing the pharmacy and any medical supplies we could find. The mall itself was a survivor's paradise, and nightmare rolled into one. Most of the stores had been abandoned when their employees stopped showing up for work. The food court was fully stocked with non-perishable supplies. The anchor stores contained everything from camping gear to electronics. But the building was also huge, with multiple levels and dozens of access points that would be impossible to secure with our small group. I spent the rest of day 7 doing reconnaissance while the others set up a temporary camp in the old Sears store. The department store had solid walls on 3 sides, only one main entrance, and a loading dock that we could use for vehicles. It also had a break room with basic kitchen facilities and bathrooms that were still functional since the mall's water system was still working. My construction experience told me that securing the entire mall was impossible, but we could fortify the Sears store and a few adjacent spaces to create a defensible compound. The key was controlling access points and creating multiple fallback positions if we came under attack. I started planning modifications using materials from the mall's hardware store and my crew's construction skills. Day 8 brought our first contact with hostile survivors. I was checking the mall's loading dock when I heard voices coming from the main entrance. 3 men had broken into the electronics store and were arguing about which items to take. They were armed with hunting rifles and seemed organized, like they'd done this before. I watched them from concealment, trying to determine their intentions. They weren't desperate refugees looking for food and shelter. These were predators taking advantage of the chaos to loot valuable items. When they finished with the electronics store, they moved on to the jewelry store, using crowbars to break open display cases. The smart move would have been to avoid contact until they left. But I couldn't let them discover our presence and potentially return with reinforcements. I also couldn't let them strip the mall of resources that my group needed for survival. So I made a decision that would have consequences for weeks to come. I confronted them at the jewelry store, my Glock drawn but not aimed. I told them this mall was occupied territory, and they needed to leave. The leader, a man in his 30s with prison tattoos, just laughed and asked what I was going to do about it. He had 2 guys with rifles backing him up, and I was outnumbered 3-1. That's when Tommy appeared behind them with a nail gun powered by our portable compressor. Miguel came out of the darkness with a sledgehammer. The odds suddenly weren't so favorable for the looters. Construction workers might not be soldiers, but we're used to dangerous situations, and we know how to handle tools that can kill people. The standoff lasted maybe 30 seconds before the leader decided discretion was the better part of valor. They backed out of the store, but not before the leader told me we'd made a mistake. He said they'd be back with more people, and next time they wouldn't be so polite about sharing resources. That confrontation taught me 3 important lessons. First, we weren't the only survivors in Phoenix, and not all of them were friendly. Second, the mall's resources made us a target for anyone desperate or greedy enough to take them by force. Third, my construction crew could handle themselves in a fight, but we needed better weapons and defensive preparations if we were going to hold this territory. Day 9 was spent turning the Sears store into a fortress. I had Tommy and Miguel reinforce the main entrance with steel shelving units and concrete blocks from the mall's construction supplies. Jake and Pedro worked on barricading the secondary exits, leaving only the loading dock accessible for our vehicles. Luis helped Maria set up a medical station in the store's former office space, using supplies from the pharmacy and medical equipment from the mall's first aid stations. The work kept everyone busy and gave us a sense of purpose, but I could see the stress building in the group. David was struggling with the transition from suburban accountant to post-apocalyptic survivor. Maria was worried about keeping Sophia healthy in these conditions. Frank was slowly recovering, but still weak. The guys from my crew were handling things better, but they were all thinking about their families and wondering if they'd made the right choice staying with me. That evening, I gathered everyone around our improvised campfire in the Sears store to address the situation. I told them we had 3 options. We could try to make it to one of the emergency shelters that were supposedly being set up by the government, though the radio reports suggested most of those were either overcrowded or had been abandoned. We could split up and each family try to make it on their own, which would probably mean death for most of us. Or we could commit to building a real community here, pooling our resources and skills to create something that could survive long term. Frank, despite his illness, was the first to speak up. He said he'd rather die fighting alongside people he trusted than freeze to death alone in some government camp. Tommy agreed, saying his family would want him to help others even if he couldn't get home to them. One by one, the others committed to staying and building something together. But I could see doubt in Maria's eyes. She was a mother first, and she was calculating the risks to her children. David was clearly overwhelmed by the whole situation. I knew I'd have to prove that we could provide security and stability before they'd fully commit to the group. Day 10 brought the test I'd been dreading. The looters returned, just as their leader had promised. But instead of 3 men, there were 8 of them, and they came prepared for a fight. They had hunting rifles, shotguns, and what looked like military surplus equipment. They also had a pickup truck with a snowplow attachment that they used to ram through our outer barricades. The attack came at dawn, when they thought we'd be least prepared. But I'd learned something from my years managing construction sites. Expect the unexpected and always have a contingency plan. I'd positioned lookouts, prepared fallback positions, and armed everyone with the best weapons we could improvise from construction tools and mall inventory. The fight lasted maybe 10 minutes, but it felt like hours. Tommy used his nail gun to devastating effect from an elevated position. Miguel and Luis flanked the attackers using the mall's maintenance corridors. Jake and Pedro held the main defensive line while I coordinated from the rear, making sure everyone had ammunition and covering fire. The turning point came when I used my construction experience to bring down a section of ceiling on 3 of the attackers. I'd noticed stress fractures in the structural supports during our reconnaissance and weakened them further with strategic cuts. When the looters took cover in that section, I brought a sledgehammer down on the key support beam and dropped several tons of concrete and steel on their heads. The surviving attackers retreated, but not before their leader shouted that we'd made enemies of the wrong people. He said they had connections with other survivor groups, and we just started a war we couldn't win. I knew he was probably right, but I also knew we'd crossed a line we couldn't uncross. We were committed now, for better or worse. The immediate aftermath of the fight revealed both our strengths and weaknesses. Maria's medical training was invaluable for treating the wounded. David surprised everyone by keeping his cool under fire and following orders without hesitation. Frank, despite his illness, had provided covering fire that probably saved lives. My crew had performed like the experienced team they were. But we'd also used up a lot of ammunition and revealed our defensive positions. The attackers had learned about our capabilities and would adjust their tactics accordingly. Most importantly, we'd announced our presence to every survivor group in the area. Some might see us as potential allies, but others would see us as competitors for scarce resources. That night, I made a decision that would define our long-term strategy. Instead of just defending our mall fortress, we needed to actively seek out other survivors and build a larger coalition. Strength in numbers was our only hope against organized threats like the looter gangs. But that meant leaving our secure base and venturing into the unknown. Day 11 brought our first recruit. A police officer named Marcus Washington showed up at our loading dock, alone and wounded. He'd been shot in the leg during a confrontation with scavengers and had been searching for medical attention. Maria treated his wound while I debriefed him about conditions in the rest of the city. Marcus had been part of a police unit trying to maintain order in the days following the eruption. But as conditions deteriorated and resources ran out, department had essentially collapsed. Officers had either fled the city to be with their families or joined survivor groups for protection. Marcus had been holding out hope that federal assistance would arrive, but recent radio intercepts suggested that Washington, D.C. was dealing with its own crisis and wouldn't be sending help anytime soon. More importantly, Marcus brought intelligence about other survivor groups in the Phoenix area. He'd encountered at least 4 different communities, ranging from a group of families holed up in a fortified elementary school to a quasi-military organization that had taken over a National Guard armory. Some were friendly and open to cooperation. Others were hostile and territorial. Marcus also brought disturbing news about conditions in other parts of the country. Radio communications suggested that the volcanic winter was worse than initially predicted. Crop failures were total across most agricultural regions. Livestock were dying in massive numbers. Major cities were experiencing complete social breakdown as food supplies ran out and heating fuel became scarce. The federal government was rumored to be operating from emergency bunkers, but there was no coordination of relief efforts. State governments had largely collapsed. Local authorities were overwhelmed or had simply abandoned their posts. For all practical purposes, civilization had ended and we were on our own. But Marcus also brought hope in the form of rumors about a federal evacuation site being established in Colorado. He'd heard radio chatter about a large survivor community near Boulder, possibly connected to military installations in the area. It was secondhand information, but it was the first concrete lead I'd heard about organized relief efforts. More importantly, it was the first real news I'd heard about Colorado since the eruption. If there was a federal site near Boulder, there was a chance Jessica might have made it there. The University of Colorado had evacuated its students, and a federal site would be a logical destination for displaced college students. I spent day 12 planning our next moves. We needed to continue building our community and improving our defenses, but we also needed to gather intelligence about the Colorado evacuation site. If it was real and accessible, it might be worth attempting the journey. But it would mean leaving behind everything we'd built and risking everything on a rumor. The decision was complicated by the fact that we'd established something valuable here. Our mall fortress was secure, well-supplied, and defensible. We had a diverse group with complementary skills. Maria's medical expertise, Marcus's law enforcement experience, my construction knowledge, and my crew's practical skills made us a formidable team. But we were also isolated and vulnerable. The looter gangs were regrouping and would eventually return in greater numbers. Our supplies, while substantial, wouldn't last indefinitely. Winter was coming, and heating fuel would become critical. Most importantly, we had no long-term plan for rebuilding civilization or reconnecting with the outside world. That evening, I gathered the group to discuss our options. I laid out what Marcus had told me about the Colorado evacuation site and asked for everyone's input. The response was mixed. Tommy and Miguel wanted to stay and continue building our community. Frank, still recovering from pneumonia, didn't think he could survive a long journey. David was interested in reaching a federal site, but worried about the risks to his family. Maria surprised me by being the most vocal advocate for attempting the journey. She pointed out that we had no pediatric medical supplies for Sophia, and the baby would need vaccinations and regular medical care that we couldn't provide. She also worried about the psychological effects on Carlos of growing up in a world of constant violence and scarcity. But it was Marcus who provided the decisive argument. He'd been monitoring radio frequencies and had picked up disturbing intelligence about a large raider army forming in the Tucson area. Multiple survivor groups were being absorbed or destroyed by a militaristic organization that was moving north toward Phoenix. If his information was accurate, we had maybe 2 weeks before they reached our area. The choice was becoming clear. We could stay and fight a war we probably couldn't win, or we could take our chances on a dangerous journey to Colorado. Neither option guaranteed survival, but at least the journey offered hope for a better future. As I lay in my sleeping bag that night, I thought about the bridge we'd been building when the world ended. We'd made it about 60% complete before the eruption forced us to abandon the project. Now I was facing a similar situation with our mall community. We'd built something solid and valuable, but external forces were threatening to destroy it before we could finish. The difference was that this time, I had a choice about what to build next. I could keep building walls and defenses, or I could start building bridges to other communities. I could focus on surviving, or I could focus on living. The decision would have to be made soon, because time was running out for all of us. Day 13 brought the breakthrough I'd been hoping for. I'd been working on the ham radio equipment we'd salvaged from the mall's electronics store, trying to boost the signal strength using construction site radio components. Frank, who'd worked as a radio operator in the Army before getting into construction, helped me modify the antenna array using materials from the hardware store. At 3 in the afternoon, we finally made contact with someone outside Arizona. A ham radio operator in Denver was coordinating communications between survivor groups across the Rocky Mountain region. He confirmed that there was indeed a federal evacuation site near Boulder, Colorado, but the news wasn't all good. The site was overcrowded, undersupplied, and struggling to maintain order. More importantly, it was only accepting new arrivals who could prove they had essential skills or resources to contribute. But he also had information about other options. There were several smaller survivor communities in Colorado that were more welcoming to refugees. Some were connected to military installations like Fort Carson near Colorado Springs. Others were organized around universities, hospitals, or other institutions that had managed to maintain some level of organization. The most promising lead was a community near Pueblo that had been established by a group of engineers and technicians from a power plant. They were actively seeking people with construction and infrastructure experience to help them rebuild power generation capabilities. The radio operator gave me contact information and suggested I try to reach them directly. That evening, I spent 3 hours trying to establish contact with the Pueblo community. The atmospheric conditions caused by the volcanic ash made long-distance radio communication difficult and unreliable. But finally, just after midnight, I got through to their communications coordinator, a woman named Sarah Collins. The coincidence of her name hit me like a punch to the gut. My wife Sarah had been gone for 3 years, but hearing that name in this context brought back all the guilt and pain I'd been carrying. Sarah Collins was nothing like my wife, but she had the same calm, reassuring voice that had helped me through so many difficult decisions over the years. Sarah Collins confirmed that their community was actively recruiting people with infrastructure experience. They had managed to restore partial power to their settlement using a combination of solar panels, wind generators, and a small hydroelectric system. But they needed construction expertise to expand their capabilities and improve their defenses against the increasingly harsh weather. More importantly, she had news about Jessica. The University of Colorado had evacuated most of its students to various federal and state facilities across the region. Sarah had been in contact with several of these sites and could try to locate Jessica if I could provide her full name and student identification information. It was the first real hope I'd had of finding my daughter since the eruption. But there was a catch. The Pueblo community was only accepting new members who could make the journey on their own and arrive with useful equipment or supplies. They couldn't spare resources for rescue missions or provide transportation for refugee groups. If we wanted To join them, we'd have to get there ourselves, which meant a dangerous journey of over 400 miles through territory controlled by hostile survivor groups. Day 14 brought a harsh reminder of why staying put wasn't an option. Marcus intercepted radio communications between raider groups that confirmed his earlier intelligence. A large military-style organization was systematically taking over survivor communities throughout southern Arizona. They called themselves the Desert Wolves, and their leader was a former Marine Corps sergeant named Colonel Martinez, who'd apparently decided that martial law was the only way to maintain order in the post-eruption world. The Desert Wolves had absorbed or destroyed at least 6 survivor communities over the past week. Their modus operandi was to offer protection in exchange for complete submission to their authority. Communities that refused were attacked and their resources seized. Survivors who resisted were killed or enslaved. Those who surrendered were incorporated into their growing army. According to Marcus's intelligence, the Desert Wolves were currently operating out of Tucson and were planning to move north toward Phoenix within the next 10 days. They had approximately 200 fighters, military vehicles, and heavy weapons. Our mall fortress, no matter how well defended, couldn't withstand that kind of assault. The news forced me to call another group meeting to discuss our options. I laid out everything I'd learned from the radio contacts and Marcus's intelligence gathering. We had maybe a week before the Desert Wolves reached our area. We could try to negotiate with them, though that would likely mean losing our autonomy and possibly our lives. We could try to fight them, though that was essentially suicide. Or we could abandon our fortress and attempt the journey to Colorado. The debate was heated and emotional. Frank, despite his recovery, didn't think he could survive a 400-mile journey through hostile territory. David was terrified of traveling with his young children, but equally terrified of what would happen if we stayed. Tommy and Miguel were torn between loyalty to the group and desire to search for their own families. Maria was the one who finally cut through the arguments with cold medical logic. She pointed out that Sophia needed pediatric medical care that we couldn't provide. Carlos was showing signs of psychological trauma from the violence he'd witnessed. Even if we survived the Desert Wolves, we had no long-term plan for raising children in a world without schools, hospitals, or social services. But it was Marcus who provided the tactical analysis that sealed the decision. He'd been studying maps and planning potential routes to Colorado. The most direct path would take us through Flagstaff and then north through Utah. But that route was heavily traveled by refugee groups and likely to be controlled by raiders. The safer route would take us east through New Mexico and then north through Colorado, adding distance but avoiding the most dangerous areas. More importantly, Marcus had contacts among law enforcement communities in New Mexico who might be able to provide assistance or safe passage. Several sheriff's departments were still functioning and had organized regional communication networks. If we could reach them, we might be able to get current intelligence about conditions ahead of us. I made the decision that night. We would leave the mall fortress in 3 days and attempt the journey to Colorado. It meant abandoning everything we'd built, risking everything on a dangerous journey, and splitting up our group since not everyone could make the trip. But it also offered hope for a future that staying put simply couldn't provide. Day 15 was spent preparing for the journey. I used my construction experience to modify our vehicles for long-distance travel through hostile territory. The Ford F-350 got reinforced windows, additional fuel storage, and a camper shell to protect passengers and cargo. We acquired a second vehicle from the mall parking lot, a Chevy Suburban that we armored using steel plating from the hardware store. The most difficult part was deciding what to take and what to leave behind. Weight and space were critical factors. We needed food and water for at least a week, medical supplies, weapons and ammunition, tools and repair parts, fuel and spare parts for the vehicles, and cold weather gear for everyone. Everything else had to be abandoned. Frank made the heartbreaking decision to stay behind. His health was still fragile, and he knew he couldn't survive the journey. But he also knew we couldn't delay our departure to accommodate his limitations. He volunteered to stay and maintain radio contact, providing intelligence about desert wolf movements and serving as a communication relay for other survivor groups. It was a noble gesture, but we all knew it was probably a death sentence. Frank was choosing to sacrifice himself so the rest of us would have a better chance of survival. I tried to talk him out of it, but he'd made his decision with the same calm determination he'd shown throughout his construction career. Day 16 brought an unexpected complication. A family of 5 showed up at our loading dock, refugees from a community that had been overrun by the desert wolves. The parents, Robert and Linda Chun, had escaped with their 3 children after their settlement near Casa Grande was attacked. They'd been traveling for 2 days and were exhausted, hungry, and desperate. Robert was a civil engineer who'd been working on water treatment systems for his community. Linda was a teacher who'd been homeschooling children in the settlement. Their kids were aged 8, 10, and 13, all traumatized by the violence they'd witnessed. They had no vehicles, limited supplies, and nowhere else to go. Taking them with us would mean overcrowding our vehicles and stretching our supplies even thinner. But leaving them behind would mean certain death, either from the desert wolves or from exposure and starvation. Maria insisted we couldn't abandon children, regardless of the risks. Marcus pointed out that Robert's engineering skills could be valuable to any community we joined. I made the decision to take them with us, despite the additional risks and complications. We redistributed supplies and passengers to make room in both vehicles. The children would travel with Maria and her family in the Suburban. Robert and Linda would ride with me in the F-350. It wasn't ideal, but it was manageable. That evening, I had my last long conversation with Frank before we departed. He'd been monitoring radio communications and had picked up disturbing intelligence about conditions along our planned route. Several communities in New Mexico had gone silent over the past week. The federal evacuation site in Colorado was reportedly turning away new arrivals due to overcrowding and resource shortages. Frank also had personal advice about leadership and survival. He'd served in Vietnam and had seen what happened to leaders who tried to save everyone. Sometimes, he said, the hardest decision was choosing who to save and who to leave behind. He told me I'd done well so far, but the real tests were ahead of us. Most importantly, Frank had been trying to contact Jessica through the ham radio network. He'd reached several operators in Colorado who were familiar with the university evacuation, but none had specific information about individual students. The best lead was a Red Cross volunteer in Denver who was maintaining lists of displaced persons, but that would require making contact after we reached Colorado. Day 17 was our last full day at the Mall Fortress. I spent the morning conducting final vehicle checks and equipment inspections. The F-350 was loaded with construction tools, weapons, medical supplies, and enough fuel for 800 miles. The Suburban carried our food supplies, additional water, cold weather gear, and camping equipment. Tommy and Miguel had decided to stay behind with Frank rather than attempt the journey. They wanted to continue searching for their families in the Phoenix area, and they felt obligated to help defend other survivor communities against the desert wolves. It was a painful separation, but I understood their decision. That afternoon, I walked through the mall one last time, remembering everything we'd built and everything we were leaving behind. The Sears store had become a real home, with individual sleeping areas, a common kitchen, a medical station, and workshop spaces. The defensive positions we'd constructed could have held off raiders for weeks if properly manned. But I also saw the limitations of what we'd created. We'd built walls and defenses, but we hadn't built connections to the outside world. We'd focused on surviving, but we hadn't planned for rebuilding. We'd created a fortress, but we hadn't created a community that could grow and prosper. That evening, we held a farewell ceremony around our campfire in the Sears store. Frank led us in a moment of silence for Carlos, who died trying to reach his family, and for all the other people we'd lost along the way. Tommy played guitar and sang an old country song about going home. Maria told stories about her nursing career and the babies she'd helped bring into the world. I talked about the bridge we'd been building when the world ended, and how that bridge had become a metaphor for everything we were trying to accomplish. Bridges connect separated places and allow people to cross obstacles that would otherwise divide them. Maybe that's what we were really doing now, building bridges between the world that was and the world that could be. Marcus shared intelligence about our route and the challenges we'd face. Robert talked about the water treatment systems he'd been designing and how they could be adapted for other communities. Linda spoke about the importance of maintaining education and culture, even in desperate times. The children mostly listened, but I could see hope returning to their eyes as they heard adults talking about the future. As we prepared for sleep, on our last night in the mall, I found myself thinking about leadership and the decisions I'd made over the past 17 days. I'd kept most of our group alive, but I'd also lost people along the way. I'd built something valuable, but I was about to abandon it for an uncertain future. I'd made hard choices, but I still didn't know if they were the right choices. The next morning would bring our most dangerous challenge yet. A 400-mile journey through territory controlled by raiders, hostile survivor groups, and desperate refugees. We'd be traveling with limited supplies, uncertain intelligence, and no guarantee that our destination would welcome us or even exist. But we'd also be traveling with hope, skills, and determination. We'd proven we could survive the end of the world. Now we had to prove we could help build whatever came next. The journey ahead would test everything we'd learned about leadership, community, and sacrifice. Whether we succeeded or failed, it would determine not just our survival, but the kind of future we'd create for the children who depended on us. As I lay in my sleeping bag that final night, listening to the wind howling through the mall's corridors, I thought about Jessica and wondered if she was somewhere out there, looking at the same ash-covered sky and hoping her father was still alive. Tomorrow we'd begin the journey that might reunite us or might end in disaster. Either way, we were committed now. There was no turning back. Day 18 arrived with the kind of clear, cold morning that would have been beautiful before the world ended. The temperature was 20 degrees below normal for Phoenix in September, and a thin layer of ice covered everything. I loaded the last of our supplies into the Ford F-350 while Marcus did final checks on the Suburban. We had 2 vehicles, 11 people, and enough supplies for maybe 10 days if we rationed carefully. Frank stood at the loading dock entrance, leaning on a crutch he'd fashioned from a mop handle. His pneumonia had left him weak, but his eyes were clear and determined. He'd volunteered to stay behind and maintain radio contact, knowing it was probably a death sentence. Before we left, he handed me a folded piece of paper with radio frequencies and contact schedules written in his careful handwriting. The first few hours of our journey went smoothly. I led the convoy in my F-350 with Robert and Linda Chun, while Marcus followed in the Suburban with Maria, David, and all 5 children. We took surface streets through East Phoenix, avoiding the major highways where abandoned vehicles and refugee camps created obvious choke points. My construction experience with Phoenix area projects paid off during those early hours. I knew which roads had been recently repaired and could handle heavy traffic. I knew where the drainage systems would flood and where overpasses might have structural damage from the ash loading. Most importantly, I knew the back routes that other travelers might not think to use. By noon, we'd covered 60 miles and reached the outskirts of Globe, Arizona. The small mining town was completely abandoned, with doors standing open and vehicles left in the middle of streets. We stopped to refuel and search for additional supplies, but the place had already been picked clean by earlier refugee groups. That's where we encountered our first real test. A group of 12 survivors had taken over the town's gas station and were demanding payment for fuel. They weren't raiders or criminals, just desperate people trying to survive by controlling a valuable resource. Their leader was a woman named Janet who'd been a high school principal before the eruption. The ethical dilemma was clear. We needed fuel to continue our journey, but paying their demanded price would leave us with insufficient supplies for the remainder of the trip. We could try to negotiate, but they held all the leverage. We could try to take the fuel by force, but that would make us no better than the raiders we were fleeing. I chose to negotiate from a position of strength while offering something they needed more than payment. Robert's engineering expertise allowed him to fix their water purification system, which had been malfunctioning for days. In exchange, they provided us with fuel and shared intelligence about conditions ahead. Janet's information was sobering. The desert wolves had moved faster than expected and were already operating in the Globe area. Several refugee convoys had been attacked in the past 3 days. The main highway to New Mexico was under their control, forcing travelers to use dangerous mountain routes with poor road conditions and limited fuel availability. More troubling was her report about conditions in New Mexico. Communication with communities there had become sporadic over the past week. Some areas were reportedly under control of a militaristic group called the Rio Grande Coalition, which was even more aggressive than the Desert Wolves. The federal evacuation site in Colorado was rumored to be closed to new arrivals due to overcrowding and security concerns. That evening, we made camp in an abandoned campground 20 miles east of Globe. I gathered our group around a small fire to discuss what we'd learned and plan our next moves. The original route through New Mexico was looking increasingly dangerous, but the alternatives were even worse. Marcus suggested we consider heading north through Utah instead of east through New Mexico. It would add distance and time to our journey, but it might avoid the worst of the raider activity. The problem was that Utah routes would take us through higher elevations where weather conditions were more severe and fuel availability was uncertain. Robert pointed out that we were already carrying maximum loads in both vehicles and couldn't afford to take detours that would require additional fuel or supplies. Linda worried about the psychological effects on the children of an extended journey through increasingly dangerous territory. Maria was concerned about Sophia's health in the cold mountain climate. The discussion was interrupted by a radio transmission from Frank back at the mall. He'd been monitoring Desert Wolf communications and had alarming news. A large raider force was moving through Globe and would likely reach our area within hours. We needed to break camp immediately and find a defensible position for the night. Day 19 began before dawn as we hastily packed our camp and moved deeper into the mountains. I used my knowledge of construction sites in the area to find an abandoned copper mine with buildings that could provide shelter and defensive positions. The site was accessed by a single narrow road that we could easily block, and the buildings were constructed of stone and concrete that would stop small arms fire. We spent the morning fortifying our position and preparing for a possible attack. Tommy's construction experience proved invaluable as we reinforced doorways, created firing positions, and established escape routes. The children helped by carrying supplies and maintaining watch while the adults worked on defenses. Around noon, we spotted vehicles moving along the valley road below our position. 3 pickup trucks with armed men were conducting what looked like a systematic search of the area. They stopped at several abandoned buildings and spent considerable time at the campground where we'd stayed the previous night. Marcus used binoculars to identify them as Desert Wolf Scouts, probably following the trail of our vehicles. They hadn't spotted our position yet, but it was only a matter of time before they expanded their search to include the mine access road. We faced a crucial decision: stay hidden and hope they moved on, or try to escape while we still had the element of surprise. I chose to wait and observe, hoping they'd conclude we'd moved on to another area. But the scouts were more thorough than I'd anticipated. Around 3 in the afternoon, one of their trucks started up the mine access road. We had maybe 10 minutes before they reached our position. The decision was made for us. We couldn't outrun them and our heavily loaded vehicles on mountain roads, and we couldn't abandon our supplies without dooming our mission. We had to fight from a defensive position and hope our preparation and superior knowledge of the terrain would give us an advantage. The engagement was brief but intense. The scouts approached our position expecting to find refugees or abandoned buildings, not a prepared defensive position with experienced fighters. Marcus and I had served in the military, and my construction crew knew how to handle dangerous situations under pressure. The key to our success was controlling the terrain. I'd positioned our vehicles to block the access road while providing cover for our fighters. The mine buildings gave us elevated positions with clear fields of fire. Most importantly, we'd prepared multiple fallback positions in case our primary defenses were overrun. The scouts retreated after losing one vehicle and taking casualties, but I knew they'd return with reinforcements. We had maybe an hour to gather our supplies and escape before a larger force arrived. The question was where to go next, since our position was now compromised and the main routes were under enemy control. Robert suggested we follow mining roads deeper into the mountains, using his engineering knowledge to navigate terrain that larger vehicles couldn't access. It was risky, since these roads weren't maintained and might be impassable, but it offered our best chance of avoiding pursuit while maintaining our eastern heading toward New Mexico. The next 18 hours were among the most challenging of our entire journey. The mining roads were barely more than trails, with steep grades, sharp curves, and surfaces that were often more rock than dirt. Both vehicles suffered mechanical problems that required roadside repairs using our limited tools and spare parts. But the difficult terrain also provided advantages. Our pursuers couldn't use their superior numbers effectively on narrow mountain roads. The harsh conditions eliminated all but the most determined followers. Most importantly, the remote location allowed us to travel without encountering other survivor groups who might report our position. Day 20 brought us to the New Mexico border, and our first glimpse of the devastation the volcanic winter had caused in agricultural areas. The Pecos River Valley, which should have been green with late summer crops, was covered in ash. Ice, abandoned farms and ranches dotted the landscape, their livestock frozen in the fields where they'd died. We stopped at an abandoned truck stop near Artesia to refuel and assess our situation. The facility had been thoroughly looted, but the fuel pumps were still functional, and we were able to top off both vehicles. More importantly, we found evidence that other refugee groups had passed through recently, heading north toward Colorado. That's where we met our most valuable ally of the entire journey. Sarah Martinez was a New Mexico State Police sergeant who'd been organizing survivor convoys and providing escort services for refugee groups. She'd been monitoring radio frequencies and had heard about our escape from the desert wolves. Sarah had intelligence about conditions throughout New Mexico and Colorado that completely changed our understanding of the situation. The Rio Grande Coalition was indeed controlling much of southern New Mexico, but they were more focused on securing agricultural resources than hunting refugee groups. The federal evacuation site in Colorado was overcrowded but still accepting new arrivals with essential skills. Most importantly, Sarah had current information about Jessica. The Red Cross volunteer in Denver had been maintaining detailed records of displaced persons, and Jessica's name appeared on several lists of university evacuees. She was believed to be at a temporary facility near Fort Carson, Colorado, which was exactly where we were hoping to end up. Sarah offered to provide escort services for the remainder of our journey in exchange for Robert's assistance with water treatment problems her community was experiencing. It was an arrangement that benefited everyone involved, and it meant we'd have professional law enforcement protection through the most dangerous part of our route. The next 2 days passed without major incident as we traveled north through New Mexico under Sarah's protection. We made good time on maintained highways and had access to fuel and supplies at survivor communities that Sarah's organization had established. The children's morale improved dramatically when they realized we were making real progress toward our destination. But day 23 brought our most serious crisis yet. We reached the Colorado border only to discover that the federal evacuation site had been closed to new arrivals the previous week. Overcrowding and resource shortages had forced officials to implement a moratorium on admissions, with no timeline for when it might be lifted. The news was devastating for our group's morale. We'd traveled over 400 miles through hostile territory based on the promise of sanctuary in Colorado, only to find the doors closed when we arrived. Maria broke down completely, holding Sophia and crying about the dangers we'd exposed our children to for nothing. David started talking about turning back, though we all knew that was impossible. It was Sarah Martinez who provided the solution. That saved our mission. She'd been in radio contact with several smaller survivor communities in Colorado that were still accepting new members. The most promising was a group of engineers and technicians near Pueblo who were actively seeking people with construction and infrastructure experience. The Pueblo community had been established around a partially functional power plant and had managed to restore electricity to several surrounding towns. They were expanding their operations and needed people with the exact skills our group possessed. Robert's water treatment expertise, my construction experience, and Marcus's security background made us ideal candidates for membership. Sarah arranged radio contact with the Pueblo community that evening. I spoke directly with their leader, a former power plant supervisor named Michael Chen, who had no relation to Robert despite sharing the same surname. Michael confirmed that they were actively recruiting skilled workers and could provide immediate housing and employment for our entire group. More importantly, Michael had connections with Red Cross operations throughout Colorado and promised to help me locate Jessica once we reached their community. He'd worked with displaced university students and was familiar with the evacuation procedures that had been used for college campuses throughout the region. Day 24 brought the final challenge of our journey. The route to Pueblo took us through Colorado Springs, which had become a major hub for refugee activity and was reportedly controlled by competing survivor factions. We'd have to navigate through the city without getting caught in territorial disputes or losing our supplies to desperate refugees. Sarah provided escort through the most dangerous areas, but her authority ended at the Colorado Springs city limits. From there, we'd be on our own for the final 60 miles to Pueblo. The roads were reported to be clear, but fuel availability was uncertain, and weather conditions were deteriorating as we gained elevation. The passage through Colorado Springs was tense but successful. The city was clearly struggling with the influx of refugees and the breakdown of civil authority, but organized raider activity was minimal. We encountered several roadblocks manned by local militia groups, but Sarah's credentials and our obviously non-threatening appearance got us through without serious difficulty. As we drove through the city, I was struck by the signs of both destruction and adaptation. Many buildings showed damage from ash loading and ice accumulation, but others had been modified with solar panels, wind generators, and other improvised power sources. Refugee camps were everywhere, but so were organized work crews cleaning streets and repairing infrastructure. It was clear that civilization hadn't ended here, it had just changed form. People were adapting to the new reality and finding ways to maintain some level of organization and progress. It gave me hope that our destination in Pueblo would offer the stability and community we'd been seeking. That evening, we said goodbye to Sarah Martinez at a truck stop on the southern edge of Colorado Springs. She'd been our guardian angel for the past 4 days, providing protection and guidance when we needed it most. Her parting words were about the importance of building connections between survivor communities and maintaining the networks that would eventually restore civilization. As we prepared for the final leg of our journey, I reflected on how much we'd changed since leaving Phoenix 6 days earlier. We'd started as refugees fleeing danger, but we'd become something more along the way. We were travelers carrying skills and knowledge that could help rebuild the world. We were ambassadors between communities that needed to work together. We were proof that cooperation and determination could overcome even the worst disasters. The last 60 miles to Pueblo would test our vehicles, our supplies, and our resolve one final time. But we'd already proven we could survive anything the new world threw at us. Now it was time to prove we could help build something better from the ashes of what we'd lost. The bridge we'd been building since leaving Phoenix was almost complete, and I could finally see the other side. Day 25 began with engine trouble that nearly ended our journey just 60 miles from our destination. The Ford F-350's transmission started slipping on the mountain grades outside Colorado Springs, and the Suburban was burning oil at an alarming rate. Both vehicles had been pushed beyond their limits during our 400-mile escape from Arizona, and the cold weather was making every mechanical problem worse. Robert's engineering background proved invaluable as we diagnosed the problems at an abandoned gas station near Fountain, Colorado. The transmission issue was manageable if we avoided high RPMs and steep grades. The oil consumption meant we'd need to add lubricant every 50 miles, but we had enough spare fluids to reach Pueblo if we were careful. More concerning was the weather forecast Marcus picked up on the emergency radio frequencies. A major storm system was moving through the Colorado Rockies, bringing the potential for heavy snow and temperatures well below freezing. If we got caught in the open during a blizzard, our mechanical problems would become deadly problems. I made the decision to push through to Pueblo despite the risks. We'd come too far and sacrificed too much to stop now because of mechanical difficulties and weather concerns. But I also knew this would be our final test as a group. Everything we'd learned about leadership, cooperation, and survival would be put to the ultimate challenge. The 60-mile drive to Pueblo took 6 hours instead of the normal 2. We had to stop repeatedly to add fluids to both vehicles and allow the engines to cool down. The children were getting restless and cranky from the extended confinement. Maria was worried about Sophia's exposure to the cold air when we stopped for mechanical work. But the most difficult challenge was psychological rather than mechanical. We'd been traveling for a week on the promise that Pueblo would offer safety and community, but none of us really knew what we'd find when we arrived. Radio contact with Michael Chun had been encouraging, but radio communications could be misleading or outdated. Around noon, we encountered our first sign that we were entering organized territory. A roadblock manned by armed civilians stopped us at the Pueblo city limits, but instead of raiders or desperate refugees, these were clearly community security volunteers conducting legitimate checkpoint operations. The checkpoint supervisor was a retired Army sergeant named Peterson who'd been expecting our arrival based on radio communications from Michael Chun. He provided us with a local area map, updated intelligence about road conditions, and most importantly, confirmation that the power plant community was real and actively seeking new members with our skills. Peterson also had news about the broader situation in Colorado that gave me hope for the first time in weeks. Multiple survivor communities throughout the state were coordinating their efforts and sharing resources. A provisional state government was forming in Denver with representatives from communities like ours. Federal assistance was limited, but local and regional cooperation was filling the gap. More personally, Peterson confirmed that Red Cross operations in the Colorado Springs and Pueblo areas were maintaining detailed records of displaced persons. He'd worked with university evacuees and was familiar with the procedures that had been used for students from the University of Colorado. Finding Jessica was going to be possible once we reached the power plant community. The final 20 miles to our destination took us through countryside that showed both the devastation of the volcanic winter and the resilience of human adaptation. Farms and ranches were obviously struggling with the loss of crops and livestock, but many had been converted to refugee camps and workshops where people were learning new skills and building improvised infrastructure. Wind turbines and solar panel arrays dotted the landscape, evidence that communities were finding ways to generate power independently. Greenhouses constructed from salvaged materials housed what looked like successful agricultural projects. Radio antennas and communication towers suggested that coordination between communities was extensive and sophisticated. Around 4 in the afternoon, we reached the power plant community that had been our destination for the past week. The facility was larger and more organized than I'd expected, with a mixture of original power plant buildings and newer construction that housed residential and workshop areas. Smoke from multiple chimneys indicated active heating systems, and electric lights visible through windows proved that power generation was indeed functional. Michael Chun met us at the community's main gate with a reception committee that included engineers, medical personnel, and families with children. It was immediately clear that this wasn't a desperate refugee camp, but an organized community with leadership, structure, and long-term planning capabilities. The initial briefing took place in a converted conference room that had obviously been the power plant's original administrative center. Michael explained that their community had grown from 30 original employees to over 200 residents, including skilled workers, families, and support personnel from across the region. The power generation system was their most impressive achievement. They'd converted the coal-fired plant to run on a combination of biomass, solar, and wind power, providing electricity not just for their own community, but for several surrounding towns. They were actively expanding their capabilities and needed people with exactly the skills our group possessed. Robert's water treatment expertise was desperately needed to improve sanitation systems for the growing population. My construction experience was essential for building new housing and expanding infrastructure. Marcus's law enforcement background would help with community security and liaison work with other survivor groups. But the most important conversation happened when Michael introduced me to the Red Cross coordinator who'd been working with displaced university students. Sarah Williams had been maintaining comprehensive records of evacuees from multiple Colorado colleges and universities, including detailed information about students from the University of Colorado. Jessica's name was indeed on her lists. She'd been evacuated from the Boulder campus on day 4 of the crisis and had been placed at a temporary facility near Fort Carson. But the records also showed that she'd been transferred twice since then, as facilities reached capacity and new sites opened. The most recent entry showed her at a community near Denver, but it was 3 weeks old. Sarah promised to help me contact the Denver community and track down Jessica's current location, but she warned me that the refugee tracking system was overwhelmed and often outdated. Many displaced persons had moved multiple times or joined communities that weren't reporting to Red Cross coordination efforts. That evening, the Pueblo community held a welcome ceremony that reminded me why we'd made this dangerous journey. Families that had been separated by the crisis were finding each other. People with essential skills were contributing to community projects that would benefit everyone. Children were attending classes in improvised schools and playing in safe, supervised areas. Most importantly, there was hope. Not just hope for survival, but hope for rebuilding something better than what we'd lost. The community had established workshops for manufacturing essential goods, greenhouses for food production, and training programs for developing new skills. They were planning expansion projects that would accommodate more refugees and provide additional services to surrounding areas. Day 26 brought my assignment to lead a construction crew working on housing expansion for new community members. It felt good to be building again instead of just surviving, to be using my skills for creation rather than defense. The work was challenging, but rewarding, and it gave me a sense of purpose that had been missing since we'd abandoned our bridge project in Phoenix. The construction team included both experienced tradespeople and refugees who were learning new skills. Working together on a common project broke down the barriers between original community members and newcomers. By the end of the first day, we weren't refugees and hosts anymore. We were neighbors working towards shared goals. But the most significant development was Sarah Williams' success in tracking down Jessica's current location. She'd made contact with the Denver community where Jessica was last recorded and confirmed that she was alive and well. More importantly, Jessica had been asking about me and was eager to reunite once travel arrangements could be made. The logistics of reunion were complicated by the fact that travel between communities required coordination and escort services. The Denver area was over 100 miles away, with several territorial boundaries and checkpoint systems to navigate. But Michael Chun assured me that regular convoy operations connected the communities, and I could probably arrange passage within a week or two. Day 27 brought our first real test as community members. A severe storm system hit the region, bringing heavy snow and dangerously low temperatures. The power grid was strained by increased heating demands, and several outlying facilities lost electricity completely. My construction crew was assigned to emergency repair operations that kept us working around the clock in dangerous conditions. We had to restore power lines damaged by ice accumulation, repair heating systems in residential buildings, and reinforce structures that were suffering from snow loading. It was exactly the kind of crisis that tested whether a community would hold together or fall apart under pressure. The response was inspiring. People with different skills and backgrounds worked together without regard for personal comfort or safety. Families opened their homes to neighbors whose heating systems had failed. Parents took care of each other's children so adults could focus on emergency work. Community resources were shared freely based on need rather than status or contribution. But the storm also revealed weaknesses in our preparations and infrastructure. Food distribution systems broke down when transport vehicles couldn't navigate icy roads. Communication systems failed when power outages affected radio equipment. Medical emergencies couldn't be handled properly when the clinic lost heating and lighting. I found myself taking on leadership responsibilities that went beyond my official construction crew assignment. My experience managing complex projects under pressure made me a natural coordinator for emergency response efforts. People started coming to me for decisions about resource allocation and work priorities. The transition from refugee to community leader happened gradually but inevitably. My group's skills and experience filled gaps that the community had been struggling with since its formation. Robert's engineering expertise solved water treatment problems that had been limiting population growth. Marcus's security background improved coordination with outside communities and regional authorities. Day 28 brought news that changed everything about our long-term planning. Radio communications from Frank back in Phoenix revealed that the Desert Wolves had been defeated by a coalition of survivor communities working together. The threat that had forced us to abandon our mall fortress no longer existed, and refugees were beginning to return to Arizona. The news was bittersweet. Part of me wondered if we'd given up too easily, if we could have stayed and fought successfully with better coordination and preparation. But I also realized that our journey had accomplished something more important than just escaping danger. We'd connected communities, shared knowledge, and built relationships that would help rebuild civilization. Frank's radio reports also included disturbing intelligence about new threats emerging across the region. Military-style organizations were forming in multiple states, some focused on restoration and cooperation, others on conquest and control. The period of initial survival was ending. But the struggle for what kind of society would emerge from the ashes was just beginning. That evening, Michael Chun asked me to join the community council that made major decisions about growth, resource allocation, and external relations. It was recognition that I'd become more than just a refugee seeking shelter. I'd become a stakeholder in the community's future. But it also meant accepting responsibility for decisions that would affect hundreds of people. Day 29 brought the opportunity I'd been hoping for since our arrival. A convoy was departing for the Denver area that could take me to reunite with Jessica. The journey would be dangerous and would separate me from the group I'd led through the crisis, but it was also the reason I'd made this entire journey. The decision was complicated by my new responsibilities to the Pueblo community. The housing construction project needed experienced leadership, and several expansion initiatives depended on my involvement. Leaving now would abandon people who were counting on my skills and commitment. But Maria made the decision easier by pointing out that I'd taught everyone in our group to be leaders in their own right. Robert had taken over coordination of infrastructure projects. Marcus was handling security and external communications. David had surprised everyone by becoming an effective administrator for refugee services. Most importantly, they'd all found their place in the community and didn't need me to make decisions for them anymore. The authoritarian leadership that had been necessary during our escape was no longer appropriate in a stable community with democratic decision-making processes. That night, I had individual conversations with each member of our original group. Tommy and Miguel had remained in Phoenix and were rebuilding communities there. Frank was coordinating radio communications between survivor groups across Arizona. Everyone had found ways to contribute their skills and experience to rebuilding efforts. The realization that hit me during those conversations was that our journey had never really been about reaching a destination. It had been about transforming from individual survivors into community builders. We'd learned to work together, to make sacrifices for the common good, and to see beyond immediate survival to long-term reconstruction. Day 30 brought my departure for Denver and reunion with Jessica. As I loaded my gear into the convoy vehicle, I reflected on the 30 days that had changed everything about my understanding of leadership, community, and survival. I'd started as a construction foreman trying to keep his crew alive, and I'd become someone who helped build bridges between communities and people. The most important lesson had been about the difference between building walls and building bridges. Walls protect what you have but limit what you can become. Bridges connect you to possibilities and opportunities that isolation can never provide. The journey from Phoenix to Pueblo had been about building bridges across geographical, social, and personal obstacles. As our convoy departed Pueblo for Denver, I carried with me letters and messages from community members to friends and family members in other settlements. I'd become part of the communication network that was slowly reconnecting the scattered pieces of American civilization. The bridge building that had started with keeping my construction crew alive had evolved into something much larger and more important: the road ahead was still dangerous and uncertain. The reunion with Jessica might not happen as planned. The community I was leaving might face new crises that required different leadership. The broader effort to rebuild civilization would face challenges that none of us could fully anticipate. But I'd learned that survival wasn't just about staying alive. It was about maintaining the values and connections that make life worth living. The 30 days since the Yellowstone eruption had taught me that leadership meant serving others rather than controlling them. Community meant cooperation rather than competition. Survival meant adaptation rather than resistance. The bridge we'd been building when the world ended had been destroyed by forces beyond our control. But the bridges we built between people and communities during our 30-day journey would endure long after the volcanic winter ended and normal weather returned. Those connections would be the foundation for whatever came next, whether it was restoration of the old world or creation of something entirely new. As I watched the Pueblo community disappear behind us, I realized that this wasn't the end of our story. It was just the end of the beginning. The real work of rebuilding civilization was ahead of us, and it would require all the skills, courage, and cooperation we'd developed during our journey through the frozen wasteland that America had become. Finding that settlement was just the beginning, because what we discovered there changed everything about surviving in this frozen world. But that's a story that deserves its own telling.